families themselves need to be more proactive and understand that some of the reasons why it is a bit of a challenge. I think some people get very concerned that is it because our families are particularly bad at talking? We all get very insecure. When you're a parent, you get this bundle of joy. We also get like a package of guilt with it as well.
Now, is there a way for me to protect my assets from my husband's future love interests if I leave all my wealth to him and I die before him?
Yes.
There is. Hello and welcome to Conscious Money. I'm Cleona and I'm really excited to share my guest with you today and talk to him about all things money. It's James Dent from the Family Elephant. James, I came across your talk with Andy Hart at a financial planning conference in the UK for advisors. And I'm fascinated by
That's right.
why we can't talk about money and, where we get stuck about money. And death definitely is high up there on the stuckness agenda. So I'm really curious to know more about you. Could you share about you and the Family Elephant?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, nice to see you, Cleona. I've been a chartered financial planner 30 years, and it's been an interesting journey, really, because what has become very obvious to me is this whole issue about family dynamics. It's not very easy within families. We're not always the best communication systems. And talking to mum and dad about death isn't easy, and neither for them to talk about their own death to us as well. So that was part of the inspiration for the Family Elephant. And the more we've gone down this journey, the more I've realized that this is a much needed area. And it's something that I think lots of professional advisors, whether tax accountants, solicitors, financial advisors, could be a lot better at. But I think families themselves need to be more proactive and understand that some of the reasons why it is a bit of a challenge. So we're on an exciting journey, and it's been obvious from day one that what we're dealing with, the issues we're dealing with, are really important, and people really need help, because I'm not sure there's that much help around.
One thing that fascinated me about your background is that you actually have a family therapy background. I don't think I've come across many financial planners with that. Is that helpful in talking to families? Because I understand that you sometimes have to cut across 3 generations or 2 generations and have quite difficult conversations.
Yeah. Well, I did a course many years ago called The Introduction to Family Therapy. So I'm not a family therapist, but it gave me a bit of an insight into that world around the dynamics of family. So it was, I found the whole thing fascinating. A lot of the people on that, I was the only commercial person with a commercial background as a financial advisor. A lot of the people there were dealing with behavioral issues, social workers through to people dealing with extremes of behavior like drugs, that sort of stuff. So seeing it into their world was really, really interesting. But the course itself really help you to understand a lot more about the world of therapy and the principles that sat behind it. So that definitely was part of the inspiration for wanting to actually deal head on with some of the challenges that families face, but do it in a way that helps them to understand that it's human nature. The fact that they do struggle with it isn't a surprise. It's wholly natural. I think some people get very concerned that is it because our families are particularly bad at talking? Is it because I'm, parentally I struggle? We all get very insecure. When you're a parent, you get this bundle of joy. We also get like a package of guilt with it as well. Am I very good as a dad, as a mum? How are we bringing them up? Is there anything that we should be doing better? There's a high level of sensitivity there, which never really, I don't think, goes away. Certainly, I've got 5 grandchildren, and I've got 2 children. My wife's got 2 children. And who are adults, between the ages of 25 and 35. So that stuff never goes away. But this whole subject of death, clearly inheritance tax comes into it, and that's part of it. And there's a lot more availability of advice in there. But I think there's a lot of improvement area in the areas, particularly around legal. And part of it is behavioral. Behavioral being, let's turn that into some kind of English. Just the way we are, the way we react. It's none of it is rocket science, but it's quite an intimidating thing until you realize, and you're shown by the right people, that actually this is a way. There is a way of really helping you, making baby steps and sensible steps that will get you to a better place and give you a lot of confidence and make sure that some of the challenges that befall families are reduced, maybe not completely avoided, but are reduced. So, that's a bit of the insight into how I got to where I did.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, every time I get depressed about how complex my family is, I look at the royal family and I think if they're bad, it's okay. All families are dysfunctional. Some families have more fun with the dysfunctional, but it is complicated, and it's helpful to have some therapeutic background and some skills in handling those kind of communications, because they can be very difficult conversations, and especially when money gets involved.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think with the royal family, you forget they are a family sometimes. And clearly you get lots of conversations going on about the level of scrutiny they're under and the pressure they're under. We're under enough pressure, I think, within our own families to try to get things right. Goodness knows what it'd be like if you have the microscope of the press, social media, etc. Don't envy those guys at all.
Not at all. I think it's good not to be judgmental, because you really don't know what other people are going through.
No.
So 60% of people, or 61, whatever the stats are, don't have wills in the UK. And there are many myths around wills, making wills. And I know that when I have annual reviews with some of my clients and they tell me that they've made a will or they've made lasting powers of attorney, they get so excited and thrilled to report back to me. Or if they haven't, then, there's like a little, like, I've been a naughty child kind of giggle. And it's on our list. And I always tell them, like, don't worry, it takes as long as it takes. I'm a financial planner myself, and it took me a long time to make my own will. So, don't beat yourself up about it. But what's your motivation speech like?
Okay, well, I think that one of the challenges people have is that they're not planning to die a week on Tuesday. But the trouble is they know their dates of birth. They don't know their dates of death. And it's very easy to keep kicking the can down the road. There are always more important things to do today to plan for the weekend coming up. There's not, this idea of dealing with your death is not exactly the most thrilling thing to do. And yet it's really empowering when you start to do that, make that journey, because you know you're doing something that for quite a while has been on the to-do list. So you gain confidence, I think, as you start doing it. So I probably would say I was far too nice to people when they said they hadn't done it.
Right.
I think we have to challenge ourselves, because if we do leave our families in a position of there being no will, then it's not as straightforward as people think. You won't necessarily be able to the delivery of what ends up happening through intestacy, which is when you don't have a will. The diktat, the way it's done, may well not be exactly what you would have wanted. So what problems are you leaving people behind? And that's one of the things that. It's all well and good saying, I've not got around to it, but you've got to find a way to get them to prioritize this. And I think it's vitally important, particularly something like powers of attorney, which obviously is there so that whether it's your other half or somebody else you pass responsibility to, if you're in a coma, whether it's through a car accident or an illness, etc., then them not being able to do anything on your behalf, whether to influence and have responsibility in dealing with the medical staff and your wishes, or whether it's financial stuff, it's not easy. And yet so many people wait till their 70s and 80s before they do their power of attorney. So they're going to do it at some point. So why not do it when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s? So then you have the protection in place immediately. And it's not just the people in the 70s and 80s who end up in a position where the loved ones around them are panicking because they've got no influence or legal ability to do what they need to, whether it's to do with your health and machines being switched off, to put it crudely, along with dealing with a bank or dealing with your solicitor, etc. So it's just a case of pulling it up the priority list, and then feeling really pleased that you've done something about it.
I had a colleague in the bank where I worked who said, it's like your voice when you're not around, your will. And I really like that, because How would you like things to go? Who would you like to have your stuff? Your children? Such important questions. But if you haven't left instructions, your voice isn't present.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And legacy is important to many of us. It's just we don't think it's an imminent issue. And it's not everybody gets a warning that they are ill and that they have a period of time before they're going to die. Yeah. And of course, that can vary in terms of what the medics tell you, because they're doing their best to guess as and correctly as possible. So yeah, it's we just want to make it much more of a natural thing, and to appreciate and understand for all of us that it's not an easy conversation. So I think that when we all know that it's a challenge, I think then people need to start the early steps on that and talk about it. And then I think then things start moving. Maybe not immediately for people, but all we can do is control our own situation. So all the people out there who don't have wills, who keep saying they're going to do wills, if you stuck £1 million on the table and said, right, you get a will done within the next 8 weeks and you get that £1 million, funnily enough, they'll do it. It's a motivation thing. So I'd probably say, Cleona, yeah, kick yourself a bit, So I'd actually be asking them to kick themselves, under the table and say, no, look, I'm going to do this because I'm going to end up doing it. So it's not easy, but it's just, ignoring that understandable emotion to delay and prevaricate and just, take it on. You'll be really surprised at how much better you feel having done it.
Yeah. What are some important tips to think about to make a will really good, really like watertight?
Well, I'm pleased when people have done wills. There are lots of people who do what we call tick box wills, which simply do the basics. Now, that's great that you've done that because it avoids, it means that you can end up ensuring that you get the right people the money that you've decided yourself. So that's a good first step. I personally think, and I think it's a challenge for all the legal world in particular, will writers, solicitors, estate planning specialists like us in the Family Elephant, we need to help them to understand that just getting a tick box will isn't enough. If you really want to protect your wealth through the family and through the generations, then you need to consider protective wills. And what I mean by that is that's a way of, and this has been done for centuries by wealthy families, is getting an opportunity to put a protective wrapping around the wealth that you pass on, so that I'll give you a prime example. If any of the next generation get divorced, any money that's gone directly to them from your will via a tick box will, 50% of that wealth is likely to disappear to the ex-son-in-law or the ex-daughter-in-law. Whereas if you use a protective will and use trust within your will, then actually it's the family trust that owns the money, not the individual. So that if that occurrence happens, frequently and mostly, that's protected against one of your next generation getting divorced. And there's a whole array of other things, that you can protect against. Care fees, things like a generation who get into drugs, gambling, or your daughter-in-law survives your son, and then she decides to do something different with the wealth that he's passed directly to her. So there's lots of ways of wealth being lost from the family, which protective wills will help with. So I think it's really important for solicitors, etc., to really educate people on it. Too often I have conversations with them and think, look, just tell them it in plain English. Don't run away from it. Yes, it's a more expensive option, but the hemorrhaging of a lot of family wealth, hard-earned wealth, because of divorce or addictions or creditors or care fees, that's the far greater cost. Rather than just get a cheap will put in place. And I'm not saying don't do a cheap will, it's better than nothing. But get some education from people on understanding what the alternatives are and why it's so important. So we're out there educating people.
Yeah, brilliant. And just to add, you work with financial advisors and referrals too, and you have very straight lines of integrity. When you get a referral through a financial advisor, you just manage the estate planning, inheritance tax, trusts, wills bit.
Yeah.
The question I had that came up was, what if I'm just a normal person that can't afford a financial planner, can't afford your services, but I'd like to get a protective will in place. How should I go about it?
Well, I think you should go to wherever you feel comfortable. There are specialist estate planners. Look online. There are high street solicitors. There are will writers, but I think you need to ensure that they are prepared to have a conversation with you. So you don't need to have a financial advisor, simply to have a conversation to get a will in place that uses the protective nature of trusts. It could be one family trust. So I would say just engage with somebody who's professional and has got lots of experience in this area and ask them that question, because not all people who write wills will actually even bother to explain or mention this. And I think that's awful.
And what should they ask? Like, do you do protective wills? Can you set up a trust? What?
Yeah. How do I protect? You could ask a simple question of, how can I leave money behind that does use trusts as a way of protecting the wealth against the challenges of life, like divorce, etc. That's what I would ask. And get them to be open with you about it, and not just say, you want a will, it will cost this. And then before you know it, you've got a tick box will with all the vulnerabilities of the wealth that gets passed on are at risk from.
Yeah. I have a very close friend who went to a high street solicitor and got a little bit, I feel, conned. Her children are minors, and they charged her quite a high fee, I think £1,500 or £1,800 to write a will. And they sold her some trusts, and all she has is a house with a mortgage on it and not much wealth. When does it make sense to look at setting up a trust, and when does it not make sense?
Right. What was your concern when it came to fearing that she might have had the wrong advice?
I don't know if, her kids are like 3 years old, and does she need a family trust to protect the assets? There's not a lot.
I would say, without knowing all the detail of the person's situation, I think the number of people, which has surprised me, of wealth where there's no inheritance tax problem. Let's say the individual has less than $500,000 within their property, in terms of residential property, and also other wealth. You think, well, actually, do they need the more? They need protective wills. Why not just tick box wills? But for people like that, the need to know that it goes into a family trust and it's accessible, whether it's for minors who really need that protection anyway, I'd argue, or whether it's grown-up adult children who it passes to, or across to your spouse. I still think trusts are a really important protective measure. And if you have £500,000 to pass to the next generation, and you've got a son and a daughter, they're going to get £250,000 each, because there's no loss of inheritance tax, let's say, because there is the potential for there to be no inheritance tax in that case. The $250,000, and then your daughter goes through a divorce, suddenly goes down to $125,000. That's even more of a problem, because that $250,000 could have made such a difference to her lifetime, both in terms of moving up the housing ladder, but also maybe when she herself comes to retirement. So I do think that there are people with less wealth where, if it's affordable, clearly you've got to make it affordable, that it's definitely still a really good option. So I don't know enough, Cleona, about the situation of your friend, but looking after minors and knowing that you have your brother or sister or your spouse who takes responsibility to make sure that the minors are looked after as little ones, rather than going direct to them. Yes, there are protections that can be put in place, but you don't want, I see too many wills where people have got that their kids make 18 or even 21 or 25, that they're going to get that money land in their bank account. Now, I'm not sure how good any of us were at 25 and making financial decisions when your mate down the pub tells you that he's got this great business idea, and look, if you can stick £100,000 in of the money you've inherited, this is going to be a big money spinner for us. I've seen situations where that's happened, and then somebody I know who lost all 250 grand of inheritance by going into a business with somebody who didn't themselves put any money in. And it was all a risk. So you've got to, it's having the right people there to make sure the right decisions happen with that money and not leaving it to the vagaries of the decision made by the individual. I think that's where the biggest con comes.
Okay. That's very useful to know, your stand on trusts. And are trusts complicated to set up for people who think, oh gosh, this is like a language that's, very foreign to me. Yeah. How does it work? Yeah.
It's a very, very important point, because you need people who can talk in language you understand. It can be as complex as the person explaining it wants to make it. And we've seen that in financial advice. You'll have seen that in financial advice, where people really never understood what they did, because you need to have it put in plain English. So I think a trust is just a legal entity, and it can be run in a very simple way. So one of the things that we do with trusts is to make sure that there are interest-free loans available for the individual, repayable when they come to die, so that the money on their death they haven't used goes back into that trust. Because interest-free loans, for instance, are a much more straightforward way of running it. There's nothing to report about any interest on the money. And it's a pro forma that we use, where everybody then makes sure that the individuals having the loan have signed, and it's legally robust. You just need a bit of education about it. And I think using companies that have trustee services can be really expensive, but it doesn't need to be. I think you just need to be dealing with the right individuals and get the necessary help of how could we run this? Once a year we have to do a meeting, potentially. And there are other things like a 10-yearly potential tax charge, but none of them need to be that difficult to administer or to even understand.
That's reassuring to hear. One of my bugbears is people who have life insurance policies and, don't have it in trust, because I think that's an easy one to fix. Do you have a preference on getting people to do flexible trusts versus discretionary trusts, or?
Yeah, well, I think discretionary trusts are flexible. So it always does need to be that. You don't want to be absolute, or where it's effectively directly owned. You need that flexibility in any trust, I think, where the trustees, whoever are the right people to help make the right decisions, family members, good friends, and the like, you want to be in a position where, if, for instance, I mentioned about drugs and gambling, if a member of your family who is there to benefit from the life insurance plan, and you can get a simple trust document from the life insurance company themselves, so it's not you don't have to pay for it, but you just need to make sure you completed the form properly. Now, if you then know that the individual has got a drugs issue or a gambling issue, and gambling's become the bigger issue in the conversations I have with people, it's too easy now to be sat in the pub with your mates rather than going on the phone, gambling at the next scorer of a goal in that Sunday afternoon football match on TV, compared to the old days where you had to go in the smoky betting shop and you might see one of your parents' friends in there or whatever. It's much easier, far too easy now to go on your phone and gamble. But you get into that addiction, then that way the trustees can say, right, you need help. We're going to pay for you to get the necessary help to get out that addiction, but we're going to pay the deliverer of that directly. We're not going to give it to you to trust in them spend that money on and suddenly find a week later that you gambled it away. So it's trusts off the back of life insurance policies are important, not where it's a joint life policy. This is where we're talking single life policies, because joint life policies is to pay money to the surviving spouse or business partner, whatever the reason for the life insurance plan is.
Yeah. Okay. And then you had some great tips about tenants in common and joint tenants when you own a house.
Yeah. The single most biggest frustration, forget about tick box wills versus protective wills. This notion that I would say well over 90%, I've got no statistical evidence of this, but based on all my 30 years of experience, people will understandably think the logic is that when we own a house together, we're joint tenants. So what happens then is one person dies, the survivor gets the full value of that directly owned themselves. Now, if you have tenants in value of that directly owned themselves. Now, if you have tenants in common, it means 50-50 ownership. But if you have a will that states that the ownership of the 50%, whoever dies, is then in a life interest trust for the benefit of the survivor, there's no restriction on the survivor. They get full use of the deceased 50%. But it means that if they do need care fees, or if they got remarried and decided to change their mind about who benefits from the will, or God forbid they got divorced from that person, that nobody can touch the 50% of the deceased. So we always know it's going to go down the bloodline or to whoever they've specified they want to get the benefit. And yet you still get use of that. You can move house, downsize, whatever it is, you can do that. So I feel that when you are buying property, or even if you're not and you own your own property, getting an understanding of whether you're have it as joint tenants or tenants in common is vitally important. It's not an expensive thing to change, but that's such a simple way of protecting at least half your house. So if care fees become an issue, you at least know that half is protected to go on to your bloodline, or whoever you've decided you want to benefit from your wealth.
So at the time of exchange, you just tell your solicitor, oh, this is my preference, tenants in common, not joint tenants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And hopefully they'll bring it up. I do have the conversation with people who say, oh, yeah, no, they did mention about that. But I told a guy who's very experienced conveyancing a solicitor that just to make sure, because, I'm married second time. So for my wife and I, we certainly wanted that. And I did say to him, look, just make sure you do that tenants common, will do. 3 months after we moved in, I just double checked with him and he said, oh, I forgot to do that. So they're focused on the house sale or house purchase, whatever it is. And you do need to ask the question. But I wouldn't sit on my hands even if it's not, you're already in that house or been there years. Find out. It's easy enough to find out whether you're a joint tenants and to get it changed to tenants in common. But you could do with that your will being amended so that life interest does exist to make sure your spouse is protected, whatever happens.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there a way for me to protect my assets from my husband's future love interests if I leave all my wealth to him and I die before him?
Yes.
There is?
Yes, Cleona, there is. First of all, you tell him that you're the only woman in his life and he should never consider another. That's one option. It's probably not robust,
foolproof, yeah.
But separately from that, it's a protective will. It comes back to protecting will. So fine for your other half to benefit from whatever wealth you personally own, but it's the life interest concept again. So I gave you the example of using life interest to allow you use of his 50% of the house for the rest of your life. But other wealth as well, you can use life interest where it effectively means that you can't use up the capital. It means that is protected, but you can use the interest on that money, on that invested wealth, the growth on it, or the income from that property. You can do that. So there are ways of protecting against a remarriage situation, say 6 years after you passed, after you died, that your husband isn't vulnerable to losing wealth that you've left behind.
It's also called interest in possession trust. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
But so, if he got half the house, could he sell half the house, or could he only just live in it?
He could sell half. Well, he could move and release the equity from his half potentially. Okay. You can't protect his 50% ownership. Mm-hmm. So that's not anything you can do because he owns it. So if you've done the tenants in common as I advise, then that will always be vulnerable, like any other wealth, like ISAs, shares, cash that he owns, or buy-to-let properties in his name. You can't protect against that because it's his. But you can manage and control the risk issues on all the wealth that you leave behind.
So my 50% of the house would still be in a trust, even if he decided to sell the house, that 50% would have to go into the trust.
Could go back in the trust. It might still be the right advice. You need to take advice at the time, but you've got the ability to then say, right, I'm going to move to another property if it's the same value.
Oh, wait, I'm dead, James. I'm dead. I'm gone.
Yes, you are dead and you are gone. But your trust exists. Right. The life interest trust exists with the 50% that you left behind. That's going to exist to pass on typically to the next generation of your family. So when he dies, the 50% that mum, who died first, left behind, that dad was able to use and move house, etc., so it doesn't restrict him, and then his 50% as well will go on to the next generation, potentially via trust. But then there are consequences around inheritance tax. The important thing is that inheritance tax isn't an issue when you put your 50% of the house or any other wealth into a life interest trust. So at that time, it delays any inheritance tax calculation till after the survivor dies.
Got it. Oh, my head is spinning already thinking about all of these different things.
Sorry. Yeah, well, there's a lot to think about, but I think the important thing is that if you look at the way most people engage on this or don't engage on it, they'll probably spend more time once a year sorting out their garage or the shed than they will. I mean, how many hours in 2023 would people look back and say, right, how many hours have you spent of all those hours in that year on this issue? And most people will say none or very little. So you can't expect to make progress and understand things without investing some time and at some point some money. So that's I think that's an important message. It's not just make yourself accountable, because your kids will be pleased you do. And you mentioned earlier in the conversation that we sometimes deal with 2 or 3 generations, particularly 2. So we've had numerous meetings between 2 different generations because we want to help explain to typically the younger generation, what mum and dad have done, or what mum's done, or dad's done, and why they've done it. Gives them an opportunity to ask questions, get some comfort in your trained explanation of things as you simplify this stuff. And then they can see what mum and dad have done. They may not always agree. Sometimes there might be pushback, and we can answer questions on it. But ultimately, they understood what mum and dad did and why they did it. There's never a question mark around, well, why did mum and dad do it? Because that conversation never took place.
That is so important, because literally anyone can challenge a will. And wills often get challenged sometimes by siblings, or like people have been left out and the conversations haven't happened, and then it's just long court battles which could have been resolved with a simple conversation.
We know of a situation, not one that we specifically dealt with, but where what you've got is mum and dad have given money to one of the next generation to help get on the housing ladder, but not the other. So they put a compensatory amount in the will. Well, that individual's decided to challenge mum and dad's will after they've died, and go through the legal case to say that it's not fair. And if there had been explanation, communication, and email, you could even get them to sign a document if you wanted, to appreciate and understand that mum and dad know that you've had benefit that your brother hasn't, or your sister hasn't. And then what we're going to do is make sure the compensatory amount. Then I think 99% of the time that would have taken the wind out of the sails of that person who then decides to go legal, because that has the risk of those siblings never talking again. And who knows where the problem will come from? Is it from he or she, or is it from their spouse who's been nudging behind the scenes saying, this is unfair, you should do this, you do that? None of us know. Part of that, not knowing situation, which is very much a family therapeutic value. But there's more we can do. How complicated is it to have that conversation or to engage whoever the professional is to explain it? It's not. And we're available to do that. And there's lots of people out there delivering that kind of service.
And to simplify things, you also have the ultimate checklist on your website, the Family Elephant.
Yeah.
And so people can go and fill it in.
So, yeah, they can. Well, I think it's a good prompt list. So it isn't just about inheritance tax or getting money to the right people. There's a life admin issue. So when you're first putting the key in the door of your mum and dad's property after the second of them has died, and you walk in and you know where the tea bags are and you know where the fridge is, but mum had said that the will was in the third drawer down of dad's desk, and then it's not there, and you're scrubbing around. All of this stuff we can help you to get sorted so that it's a soft landing. You're not around anymore, and you already know where all the key documents are. You even know, who the key service providers are, whether it's the local plumber, carpenter, whatever it is, and who your house insurance is with. If you need to make a claim because there's been a leak in the middle of winter in your mum and dad's property that is going through the whole probate process. So these are all the considerations to think, I want my legacy to be as positive as possible and leave as much hassles avoided, because people are grieving at the loss of you. And the last thing they then need is to handle a load of stuff that you'd never got around to doing. So yeah, there is a checklist on the Family Elephant website for that.
To make life admin easy, because who likes life admin? Nobody.
Yeah, nobody.
Unnecessary life admin. What about money to kids? What are your thoughts on, giving money to children?
Yeah, they don't deserve it. That's my view. I think it's clearly banking mum and dad is so important these days, particularly getting on the housing ladder and university education. It's something that's really important to help people to understand. One, is it affordable for you? I think that's one thing. You need to be confident that it's not going to diminish your own quality of life. It's your wealth to decide what to do with. But if you possibly can help, it's a great way to invest into your children. Getting on the housing ladder, the average age, which is more like late 30s now, whereas it used to be late 20s. What a difference that makes to people to do that. Thankfully, I was in a position to help my son. The age of, he was 23 at the time, to get on the housing ladder. And his property's already gone up in the 2 years since that happened. If he was buying now, he'd have to pay another £100,000 for that same property. So it is a really important thing, but you need to have protections in place. If they're buying with a spouse or a partner, then you need to make sure that there is some protection in place if their relationship went south. And somebody I've dealt with in the last 6 months gave me an example of his brother who had bought property with grandparents' money, dealt with a solicitor about it, just in terms of conveyancing, etc. And then the relationship went south, and suddenly half that money is going to go to somebody that they didn't marry. And when they went back and asked the solicitor, hopefully lots of solicitors wouldn't do this, but they said, well, look, I was acting for both of you, so I really wasn't in a position to say anything. I just think that's awful. So, yeah, you just need to get some advice. Is there a way I can protect this wealth? It's no negative slight on whoever their partner is. It's just sensible housekeeping.
Yeah. So you mean if a dad gave a gift to his daughter, for example, and she got into a relationship, and you'd make sure that the title represented, well, how would you do that?
Well, you could have a loan document,
right,
just to protect that money.
Right.
You could say some people that we deal with want it repaid over a period of time. They decided that one of their principles is people need to work for it, or they need to be accountable for. Yeah, I'll give that and help you as a loan, but it's not an outright gift. So that's one way of going. Other people will go, look, I'll help you to save towards that expensive car or to go traveling, and I'll match fund whatever you do. That's a hybrid of what your options are, or it is an outright gift. So yes, fine to do that, but you just need to know the vulnerabilities of that money if something does happen. That's why I think the property house deposit in particular it's really important that you consider ways of protecting that wealth if the relationship doesn't work out.
Yeah. And the guardianship of children and vulnerable children, while we're on the topic of kids. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention is I love telling dads that they can make third-party pension contributions for their kids, like the elderly kids, because that always is great, that
you like telling your dad that?
The dad clients,
Oh, the dad. Sorry, I thought you meant your dad.
No.
Right. No, okay.
Just because it's a way of giving money, but...
Great way to go.
Sorry?
Yeah, it's a great way to go, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it annoys kids because they go, what? I've got to wait till 57 before I can get hold of that. You can't spend it. But I tell you, when they get to 57, they'll be blooming glad that mum and dad did that for them.
And the compounding and, hopefully getting them engaged a little bit more in their pensions too by having that conversation with the dad. Guardianship of children, I think that the letter of wishes when you make a will and you mention details about the guardianship of children, like, if there was a conflict between the families, the in-laws, religion versus sports, what are my priorities, Also, in the letter of wishes, you can say, I don't want this uncle with the temper tantrum issue to be the guardian of my child. You can actually explicitly state, I would prefer these people, but not these people.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular tips on the guardianship of children? And is there a way to also, are there like special trusts for vulnerable children?
I don't have much experience when it comes
Okay.
to that. The one thing I would say is, so seek advice for people who would have a good understanding of that. I think on the safeguarding of children, I think, but it's to do with all wills, writing things down in a simple Word document, handwritten or otherwise, but don't over worry about writing stuff down. It doesn't need to be in legal language. We've had some brilliant letters of wishes done, which is effectively a document that's flexible because you don't have to, you've got your will. You can then say, this is the charities I want to use. And I wouldn't put that in a will. You might change your opinion on it, but I would have it in a side letter because there's too many examples of charities then becoming quite aggressive around what level of money they're getting off the back of a death in a probate case. So your principles of the way you would like, you can't dictate it, the way you would like that wealth in the family trust to be used is really important. For some people, it's really important to say you do what you want to do. No rules, fine, because it's your wealth, you decide. But there's many examples we've got where people are very clear on why they prioritized housing ladder ahead of education, but the education's number two. Now, for them, for instance, they say, well, education is generally provided. They can get student loans when they're at university, whereas getting on the housing ladder is something they are going to have to do themselves. Right. So those kind of examples, you pick up ideas, some brilliant ideas from your clients on what can go in and what their opinions are. Emergency funds, if something were to happen to any member of the family and it needed a specialist operation, but it meant going overseas, that kind of stuff. There are other things that can come into your side letter and get it 70% right. Don't expect perfection. You can always change and develop it. And we review these things once a year with all of our Family Elephant clients, just to remind them what they said. And it might be that we've got some ideas, but more likely they might themselves have heard of a situation that they want to protect against. So side letters are great to bring alive some sense of what your areas of emphasis would be and how the family wealth is used.
That makes so much sense. So when you say don't name the charities in your main will, but have a referenced side letter and say, I prefer that the money is distributed this way, because then the charities get aggressive and they get involved in the selling of the house.
They can do.
Yeah.
Well, they may even dispute.
Right.
There may be elements of plenty of examples where there's legal disputes and they are not happy with the level of money they've got. There are lots of charities who are absolutely, straightforward and easy to deal with, but some are more aggressive because you have professional people who are employed by that charity to get as much money as they can out there. You need to, I would suggest, you don't need to, but I would recommend that if you keep that in a separate document that you can amend and change rather than have to change the will every time, it's cheaper. You just get to make sure that you sign that side letter. You let the executors and any future trustees know exactly what your latest thinking is. They've got the very latest document. And it doesn't matter about the wording. There's no legal language to be used, as I mentioned earlier. So it just brings alive and helps to give comfort to executors and to trustees in particular that they know how to best use that money. But they also have the flexibility to know that things may happen 20 years after you've died that you wouldn't expect, or circumstances are different. But, they don't have to follow to the letter of what you've put in the letter of wishes, but it's a good guidance and gives them some sense of your principles and what you feel is really important.
That is very valuable to hear. Parallel wealth. That's something you talked about. And then also DTTs and offshore bonds. I remember you didn't like DTTs too much when we spoke. So I'd just like to have your thoughts. It's nice to have the sort of color. Yeah, a bit of controversy as I hear some financial advisors who sell a lot of DTT screaming from the wings. You should probably explain what discounted gift trusts
Yes.
are. Yeah.
Yes. So when it comes to passing wealth on, there are a number of options. People need to realize that when you're planning to avoid inheritance tax with the wealth you pass on, so we're talking about 40% above your allowances, which is a hell of a chunk of money to be giving to the taxman and not retaining within the family. On money you've already paid income tax, national insurance, VAT, etc. So there are options like discounted gift trusts, but it has a fixed amount that's repayable of the original capital that goes in. So if you put 100,000 in, typically 5% a year comes back to the individual who put it in to spend. But there's been lots of examples where people haven't needed that money over that 20 years and that it all ends up back in their estate. So all those 5% over 20 years, all that original £100,000 is back in their estate. There are reversionary options, a reversionary trust that gives you the choice to decide whether you need some of it, all of it, or none of it in each year over a 10-year period, etc. So it makes much more sense to have that flexibility rather than it being not being optional. So you also said something else prior to saying
parallel wealth.
DGT, I know, which is discounted gift trust.
Yeah. You talked about parallel wealth.
Parallel wealth, yeah. So this is the idea that you have the generations of the family, and there's a red line between each generation, which is the 40% tax vulnerability of inheritance tax. Whereas if you place money into trusts which are in parallel down the generations, they travel down that parallel channel without ever going through those red lines of inheritance tax. Because if you lose 40% inheritance tax, that money could go to the next generation who themselves already have amount of wealth that one day will have inheritance tax applied. So all you've done is add to the inheritance tax problem. Whereas if you're using family trusts to travel down in parallel to the generations of the family owned, it's a legal entity, as I mentioned earlier, that's a great planning opportunity. And we use things like pension funds, sometimes family investment companies. There are a number of options down that parallel wealth to help protect wealth and to make sure it doesn't lose inheritance tax, but using trust to avoid for divorce and that sort of thing, as I mentioned earlier.
Brilliant. Does this make sense only for rich folks, though? Like, how much money do you have to have?
Well, I think I mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, look, a protective will is more expensive than a simple will. And if you can only afford a simple will, do a simple will. But if you can do a protective will and can afford it, and we provide an option where you can phase pay it over a 12-month period to make it affordable. So it depends on your circumstances and how concerned you are or not about the idea of wealth going directly to individuals with all the vulnerability of drugs, gambling, creditors, care fees, etc. So only you can make that decision really as to whether it's affordable and appropriate for you. But as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, that I think when we're dealing with an increasing number of people who don't have an inheritance tax problem, but because it's a smaller amount of wealth, but still an important amount of wealth, they don't want to see any of that half through divorce, etc. So it's still very relevant, if not more relevant for those people.
So you're saying it's more about the principle of protecting your wealth rather than the value of it. Just making like that smaller amount of wealth might be so much more relevant to the person who inherits it rather than, I get it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then offshore bonds, you tend to use offshore bonds in your tax planning? Tax planning?
Yeah, it can help within trust because it simplifies the running of the trust, because it's what they call a non-income giving asset in the eyes of HMRC. So there's less to report.
Yeah.
And so we do use offshore bonds, but we also use general investment accounts. So it's a different type of wrapper, which is whereas offshore bonds go down the income tax channel, the general investment account that runs down the capital gains tax channel. So it's a different tax regime that applies on the growth that you get on that money. So you just need to get the right advice on it. But yeah, offshore bonds can be a great way of investing within trusts because it doesn't create the need for reporting anywhere near as much.
And if there are financial planners who want to learn more about how they can serve their clients with inheritance tax and offshore bonds, is it Canada Life, or which websites do you recommend reading up on?
I would recommend a few. I would say Canada Life International. We're a big fan of offshore bonds just because you then have better control of knowing when the tax becomes relevant. Whereas if you have it onshore, then you know that you're going to lose basic rate equivalent of basic rate tax every year. There's no choice. Whereas offshore, you've got the choice. It'll end up being taxed at some point potentially. But also, I would recommend Way Investment, who use general investment accounts in a similar way. Both these firms we've used a lot, and it's great because it's a reversionary option. It gives you the flexibility to access that money still, so you haven't lost the ability to use it for your own needs, which is, I think, is a big concern for people and why they might avoid inheritance taxes. They think it does mean giving up control and access. So you just need to get the advice from an experienced estate planner, experienced financial planner, who will know about these options and then put that ahead of things like discounted gift trusts, which are so much more rigid in the way that you get the money, some of the money returned to you. So, yeah, it's get the right advice. But those are two. I'm sure there are others out there, but I would certainly put those forward to the financial advisors out there to look at wealth preservation accounts with Canada Life International, and then the Way investment options where they have a built-in trustee service too.
Fantastic. That's quite helpful and practical advice. This has been really fascinating, James. How do people get in touch with you?
So, yes, we have, obviously, we've got the website, familyelephant.co.uk. On there, inquiries can come through to us. We are on Twitter. We are on Instagram. And Twitter is at the Fam Elephant, not the Family Elephant, at the Fam Elephant. Okay. But you'll see Instagram, we are the Family Elephant on there.
And the services that you offer are protective wealth, parallel wealth, and you also work with professional advisors. So people like me can refer clients to you.
We do. Yes. So I think working in a proactive way to make sure that people get the kind of service that historically financial advisors in particular get frustrated about. Where often people refer across and don't get any feedback on what's going on with that client, and the service levels are not what they would have hoped for. It's very frustrating, and they don't get any cross referrals back to them, even though they must be seeing clients that would have been relevant for them as financial advisors. So yeah, we do deal with a lot of financial advice firms, but it is wills, it's trusts, it's powers of attorney, it's consultancy to wealthy families more likely because they can afford it, and it's more complex arrangements. So at any one time, we're dealing with some wealthy families on understanding all of their circumstances, all about family dynamics, and then we help them to come up with a bespoke strategy and then help to implement it all. So there are lots of different options.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, James. This has been very helpful and fascinating.
Thanks, Cleona.